Awesome. Well, I'd like to start off, Dustin, by introducing you and sharing a little bit about my experience of getting to know you. So, I guess you and I have known each other for like almost a decade now. Totally. Like,
Yeah,
time really
that's
flies.
crazy. That's crazy.
And I first met you when I was having a musical hiatus. And at the time, I was just focused on family life and being a dad, you know?
Right.
And I noticed that when I had kids, I'd stopped playing music pretty much and just focusing on the family life, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So around that time, my wife and I moved to this little town neighboring the church where you're a director. We were looking for a church at the time, and we happened upon this church in Marysville, Washington, you know,
Yeah.
Mountain View Presbyterian. And one of the things that we really loved about the church was the music and the band. So it wasn't a very long time before my wife, Jennifer, encouraged me to just go and chat with you. And of course, with Jackie, who is the pianist in the band. I'm sure she's okay with me just saying her first name, right? And I was like, oh man, I haven't played drums in quite a long time, but also that would be so cool.
Yeah.
Um, so I went and I talked to you and I tried out for the band. Things worked out really well. I actually credit you, Dustin, with getting me back into music.
Uh,
Yeah, so since that time, I've done quite a bit. I've gotten into music production, especially mixing and engineering. And in that time, I've probably produced a couple hundred songs, like in the last 5 or 6 years, right?
yeah.
You know, Dustin, another thing that really helps me to do is learning so much about live audio. And you introduced me to Presonus, which is now the software and the hardware that I use for basically like everything. Yeah, man. Well, I feel like I'm a constant student, especially like with hardware and the software, but the capability is fantastic. And I just feel like I've been able to produce really kind of pro quality music at this point. And credit to you.
I've been
Wait.
listening to a lot of your like the stuff you send me on like YouTube for the last probably 3 months or so, and just listening to the audio quality. Even working with you've had kind of different musicians and you've played a lot of the stuff yourself, and that always varies and stuff depending on who you're working with. But just I just listened to the engineering quality of stuff. And I hear you're just developing and your just a knowledge of the equipment you're using, but also just like you can teach equipment, but you can't teach like a good ear. That's just something that someone has to develop on their own. You can point things out and when I work with sound people, I try to encourage them I ask them questions about what they hear because I think that's the only way to
Yeah.
get somebody to kind of, self-assess and go, oh yeah, and create those pathways in their brains for themselves. But yours is, you were an easy person to, an easy student because you were like you said, you're a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've heard your quality just increasing over the last few months. It's been really cool.
Thanks, man. I mean, honestly, I always appreciate the compliments, but actually, this is all about you, my friend. So, one of the things that I've mentioned in other interviews that I've done is that I really don't like being in the spotlight that much, if I'm being honest. I tend to shine more behind the scenes, which I think is part of why I really love music production so much. You know, a chance to be in the studio and take other people's music and find a way to bring it to their vision to the best I can, right? So, and I definitely want to learn all about you and your background. But first, I do want to share a little background on this interview and kind of why I've asked you to do this. So, I recently produced a video. It was all about the world of creatives and living in a world which is, let's face it, not necessarily a creative world, and how it can sometimes feel a little bit challenging. I guess that's one way to put it. Where, if you're a creative type of a person, which you definitely are, and I feel like I am too, then sometimes you might experience a world where like schools and jobs and things like that are just not always set up for that kind of a personality,
Yeah.
right? So then, one of the things that I've always admired about you is you actually live in the creative world and you've made a living in the creative world. And I really feel that you must have taken plenty of risks along the way to do that for yourself. And ultimately, Dustin, I just got to say I'm super proud of you.
Oh,
So, taking those risks and being the kind of person that is living that life, that's something that a lot of us honestly aspire to. And so, all that to say, the whole goal that I have today for this discussion is learning more about you and, of course, really how you did that. So, but before I get too deep into that, I want to learn a bit more about your background in music. And I'd love to know how you got started. When did you first know that, you wanted to be a musician?
um, gosh, it starts with good educators, I think, for my life. I think I think that's the same story for a lot of musicians, is we kind of experimented with it a little bit in school, and then we had great teachers that encouraged us. I attribute 100% of what I'm able to do these days based on being guided and being super lucky, but also just being guided all the way through from, I think my first choir class that I did was in fifth grade. And it was just like, oh, here's some songs, I don't even remember if we did like one or two part harmonies. It was just a sing along with soundtracks and stuff. But I just remember that teacher being so like fun, and all of my teachers were great, but this one was just like, I was like, there's something different about this teacher. She has so much joy for what she's doing. And it just felt like recess almost, indoor recess. And
Mm,
so it was, and then it just from there was great. I really started doing music passionately starting in seventh grade playing saxophone. And I had a incredible band teacher. This is in Southern California. A shout out to um, Jody Urquidez. Not sure I understand. Oh, Siri wants to participate. Um, who I recently, like last year, I was like, I'm gonna just reach out to her and wrote and like let her know. I hadn't spoken to her since my family moved away when I was in ninth grade, and we moved up to Oregon. But I was like, I bet I could find her on social media, and because she just really injected this passion of good quality, fun music in me.
mm,
Starting in seventh grade as a band teacher, and I just was like, this is what I want to always do music. I didn't think I was ever going to be a professional musician at that point. I just knew I wanted music to be part of my life. And that's most musicians, right? I would say majority of musicians
yeah.
have it as a part of their life, but not necessarily their mainstream of income. So those two separate concepts. But and then fast forwarding down my own timeline, um, I as I'm not thinking that music is even a career option. My parents always wanted me to be doing medicine, and so I got really involved with in high school Health Occupation Students of America. I had really great teachers there that created programs and partnered with other programs. I was a CNA by the time I was 17, and I was an
Wow.
EMT when I was 18,
Wow.
and I did an internship with a dentist for 6 months, just trying to explore different medical fields that I was considering getting into. And I loved anatomy and physiology. I loved the science and stuff. But the thing that turned me away was the trauma and I can't compartmentalize my emotions and traumas from work. And that's a very, high stress, high impact, patient, something goes wrong and a patient passes away, or um,
Yeah.
it was really too hard for me to come home and feel like a normal person. Even with therapy at a young age, trying to like, work through that stuff, I just realized I don't want to come home every day feeling like this. And so, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I, long story short, I realized I wanted to do something different besides medicine. And so I started studying music as a saxophone major in undergrad. And then I had again, another educator who came up to me and said, "Have you ever thought about singing?" And I'd never sung. I did that fifth grade choir once, and but I never thought I had. In fact, I had never tell somebody that they have that they can't sing, or that they, especially if that's somebody like looks up to you. I had a family parental type figure in my life just make a small comment when I was singing along with a song in the car one day, of just like how I shouldn't do that because it doesn't sound good. And I wasn't offended or mad or upset or anything. I just took it as fact. I
Mm,
took it as like, oh, this is an adult, so they must know exactly what, they're talking about.
right.
And so I know I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be an instrumentalist. Then I'm not, no, I'm never going to sing in front of people because that's
Yeah,
not going to
exactly.
go well. And I excelled pretty well as an instrumentalist. But in high school or in college, undergrad, this professor was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about, um, joining choir and being a choir person?" I was like, "I don't know, I maybe." And
Yeah, because you kind of have that ingrained, right? Like maybe from an early age when somebody made a comment like that, I don't know, I guess it just sticks with you.
yeah, yeah. I was like, I didn't share what that person had said to this professor. I was just like, no, I've thought about it, and they seem like they have a really great time, and it's such a tight community at this school, and but I don't know, I'm not feeling that. And he's like, well, why don't you come and check it out? And so we did, and then a short while later, he said, you've got really great rhythm. Have you ever considered, conducting? I'm looking for a conducting student. And I was like, oh,
Cool.
that would be awesome. I'd love to learn at least, a little bit about that. And so he started kind of giving me some lessons and teaching me a little bit about, I was a music education major, and so we did like conducting class and stuff, but this person showed just kind of a deeper interest. And so, yeah, I ended up going to a conducting festival in Bulgaria that this professor signed me up for, and the whole choir went as a guest choir, and he and I got to do special conducting workshops with these really terrifying maestros in front of a live orchestra and then a live choir. And I'm
Wow.
I'm like,
Yeah.
gosh, how old was I then? 19 years old, 20, something like that. I don't know. Um, and I was just like, this is the most terrifying but exhilarating thing in my life. And so that was that point, I think, where I was like, I think really like I could do this career in music. And I don't know if I want to teach. Music education seemed like the smartest major. Um, and then I yeah, I ended up switching schools, and the school that I switched to, they did not offer it as a major, the music education. They had a music performance degree, basically a bachelor's of music. And so I finished the program there after a little bit of extra time, and then as a saxophone performance major, but I was still doing some conducting stuff there. And then again, another educator, Solveig Holmquist, she said, you're really great at conducting. Would you consider doing your master's with me? She was going to
Wow.
retire, and she said, I'll stay for 2 more years and do your master's with you. Um, and and I was like, oh
Wow.
my gosh, okay, yeah, let's do that. And I had the best educational experience ever. And that, I think, was in that moment that I started to realize, like, okay, I'm pretty good at this. I've got all these educators in my life who have believed in me, and I'm just having the best time. I'm learning constantly. Like at the previous school, I felt kind of like a big fish in a small pond. And then when I transferred to a larger state school, I realized I was learning more in a week than than I was in an entire semester at this other school. And so yeah,
Mm.
I just had so much affirmation along the way of just like, you might be able to do this, you might be really good at this. And um
Well, then, I mean, it's not like you never tried other career paths. As you said, you were an EMT, right? And you were involved and interested in the medical
yeah.
world. And by the way, you're not the only musician that was an EMT. I'll have you know, David Lee Roth was actually an EMT. just a tidbit for you to chew on. Yeah.
Really?
Just
Really?
well,
It's not, it does not surprise me that you know things like that. You know the craziest statistics and factoids. Yeah.
I mean, I tend to know a lot of things about Van Halen for some reason. My childhood rock band. It's useless information, but I still have
Well,
it
it's
anyway.
it's useful in this interview.
Well, I need to ask you before we go too much
Yeah.
further. So you experienced and you looked into different fields, and you were focused on getting into medicine at first,
Yeah.
but you ended up getting into music in the long run. So my question is, how accepting was your family of that plan, and really how supportive were they of you?
I think it was a lot of conversations. Um, I excelled in the medical field. I loved the science of it. I scored the top of my class in my testing and in my state testing, and um, I moved up quickly as a CNA and then a CMA. I tested into being a medication aide. I worked in emergency department. I love the fast pace um,
Wow, no kidding.
environment and how something was new all the time. Um,
Amazing.
And then when I was falling out of love with it and realizing this is not who I want to be, having those conversations with my parents at first, they were like, you'll be fine, like just power through it. And they come from a generation that was a lot less fortunate than my generation. And where their context and environments that they grew up in was like, if you found a great paying job, you held on to that no matter what. And I think people my age, and especially now the next generation, we're more like, we will choose to leave an environment that is toxic, even if it pays amazingly over the quality and choosing that quality of life. And so,
Yeah.
having those conversations with, I'm 41 now, so this was a long time ago, but having those conversations with them, and ultimately, they've always were supportive, shocked for sure, and your parents always want what's best for you, but they were always very supportive parents that said, well, at the end of the day, we want you to be happy, but you're going to have to work twice as hard to make half as much money,
Mm,
as what it comes down to. And they're not wrong. They're still to this day are not wrong, but
yeah.
um,
I mean,
it's been it was really good conversations with them, and so I'd say it was a mix. At first, it was like, what are you talking about? That's the dumbest thing that you've ever said your whole teenage life, um, and then I think as I became slowly just, a little bit more successful and started to show that like you can make a career in the arts, they were like, okay, we're really proud of you for following your heart and doing that. And yeah,
I mean that's just wonderful, man.
not really an extreme one way or the other, I think, but always supportive at the end of the day.
I can ask this question, and looking back, without getting too far ahead of myself, looking back now, I'm assuming you feel grateful for the path that you have chosen in your life. I mean, is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, and to be clear, I don't think that 100% of the reason why I am here is because of all of my choices. Like I think, yes, I was involved and choices were made totally, but
Right.
I'm very fortunate. There are a lot of people who make the right choices, and especially those who are trying to go into arts and stuff, that are not successful, or they're financially not successful. I think all artists can be successful. It depends on how you're measuring it, of course, but to come down to like brass tacks, like if you're actually making a living, and I had a ton of student loans to pay off, a ton of student loans. I would do that differently. Um,
Right.
but I am very grateful, and I feel very affirmed in my choices to do what I do. I still read, medical things for fun, and I'm still able to kind of like feed that beast a little bit. But and I use some of it. I use a lot of it actually in the way that I teach my ensembles and stuff. I use a lot of actual, like um, talking about the way that physics of sound work, all the way to the way the human body produces sound, and even using other muscles and the concepts of like eurythmics and stuff in teaching. So
Wow. I mean, that wouldn't have even occurred to me. That is literally so cool.
Yeah, it wasn't all for nothing, I apply a lot of that into it. And like for example, when I was in high school studying microbiology, I learned that if you take the tissue sample of one frog, let's say, and it's beating on its own, and you take a tissue sample of a different frog, and they're beating at different rates on their own. The moment you touch them together, they beat as one. It's all, electrical things. And I use that concept, whether it's metaphorical or like, maybe it's emotional or to get people to like, connect in a deeper way. But there is something that happens. And the more, if you watch like Neil deGrasse Tyson and stuff, the more we learn about the way that molecules work and that the way they exchange, we start to realize the symbiosis more and more and more. And I think
Wow.
there's no more evidence of that than in the careers that are less tangible, such as the arts and music,
Mm, yeah.
that are more and more, solid evidence of just it's not black and white. There aren't these hard lines between things. There is connectivity in between humans and nature and music and um,
Man, so cool.
yeah, I'm getting way off tangent.
But that's okay. I mean, the frog example,
Yeah,
I mean, my mind went to that is exactly how a band works.
exactly. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, and when I work with younger singers, especially like high school, if I'll go in and do adjudications and stuff, and if they're ever having trouble, and I use this with my adult groups all the time, but if they're ever having trouble synchronizing in time, and that can happen for a number of different reasons, but if for whatever reason the thing they need to work on the most is the rhythm of the song, I will have them put their hands on each other's shoulders, or link arms, or do some sort of like physical connection. And 99% of the time, it's done. That's not an issue anymore. And so it's the
Wow.
band is the same way. The longer a band plays together, the more they start to anticipate what each other's moves are, right? And it's this, I've noticed the same thing in sports too. Like any partnership, you start to be able to read your partner really well the longer you've played together. It's the same thing in marriage. Like how often, if you've been married for longer than 5 years, how often are you able to guess your partner's end of sentence, right? So it's all the same
Mm-hmm.
concept, of just
Yeah.
connectivity, like vulnerability equals connectivity. And
I have to be honest with you, Dustin. All the bands that I've ever been in, we never held hands.
yeah, well, now you
but, we,
should.
but we probably should have, right? I mean,
But it's not just the whole, it's not the actual physical touch, but like breaking bread together, like having a beer
right.
together, right? Having a meal together, spending time outside of rehearsal. Um, the bands and the choirs and the orchestras and the ensembles that are the most successful are the ones that have fun together.
Right.
Like I'll train a lot of ensembles for state competitions and stuff. I'll get called to come in different high schools that are preparing different things. And especially with small groups when it's like quartets or quintets and stuff, I'll say, you guys are busy. High schoolers are way busier than any of us ever were in high school.
Yeah. Now,
But if you could find the time to just go sit down and have a slice of pizza together, or like outside of rehearsal, find a time to go over to each other's house and just play a video game or watch a movie, like hang out outside of when you're required to hang out
yeah.
and see how your music takes off.
Right.
And I firmly believe it's one of the foundational things in all of the ensembles that I work with right now regularly in my adult groups, like community, like authentic community, not just like, oh, we're all required to go to this event together and stuff, but it's like, do we, do we organize like a hangout after rehearsal where we go to this pub and just have a beer and just laugh, or do we go and have social time after a concert, things like that, I think strengthen, because you then when you're sitting in those rehearsals, you care more about, just without thinking about it, your default is you care more about that drummer or that bass player or that alto or whatever. um, and so then you genuinely are tuned in to what they're doing, and which just begets better music.
That is so cool, man. I mean, I really, really love that. So, I want to ask you about your first real job in music.
Hmm.
Do you remember what it was? And ultimately, how did you get that job?
So it just depends on like what you mean real job. Like I did gigs. If we don't count gigs, so I was a drummer for some singer-songwriters a lot in college. We'd play a lot in Portland or Salem area, or college towns. And I made some pretty good money from back then. It felt like great money as a college student who didn't make hardly any money. Um, you know, Pretty good. Or I'd get hired for like a yacht club once that did this big dance, party. And so those are like, I don't know, those are gigs. But if you're talking like real first job, it would probably either be a church gig that I did for as a worship leader, playing guitar and singing and leading the band that started pretty part. It was like halftime gig in Salem, Oregon. Um, and I'd done worship leading kind of up to that point and a lot in the first college that I went to and stuff. But
Okay, gotcha.
yeah, it wasn't, I was always still so focused on school um, that even up and basically my first like full-time real music gig was Mountain View, was the church that we met at.
Hmm.
And I was just willing to leave my state, my home territory for a job. I wanted to stay in the Pacific Northwest because I love it so much. But um, yeah, Mountain View was like my first full-time um, gig where I was like, all right, I'm gonna move away from home even further and go to where there's, a paying gig. And I think I made like 30 or $35,000 a year, back in 2011 and as a full-time uh, worship leader. And then I always knew I wanted to conduct and like that's where I felt the most joy in my life.
Right.
But yeah, that was my first, and I transitioned, kind of, that's a complicated story, transitioning away from the church and then coming back to that church. And, but yeah, the church was always a safe place to practice instruments as well. As a saxophone player, as a drummer, as a bass player, as a guitar player, like it was always a really encouraging place. There would be one out of 100, one grumpy man who was like, those drums are too loud. And then the other 99 people were just like, hey, we really appreciate you giving your gifts and you're working on your craft. And old people are especially gracious at and recognizing um, and appreciating that level of, those things. Whereas for me, I was like, I just want to work on this and get better at this. They see it as such a gift. The wisdom of elders can be really a great and supportive environment to, because when you're starting out, you're such a bad player. You're like, I think back to some of the saxophone performances that I gave or solos that I did at a church, and these sweet little old ladies coming up to me and just be like, oh, it was such a blessing. And I just think in my head, like, were we in the same place? Are you talking about me or are you talking about somebody else? Like, because I know, I heard it. I was there, and I appreciate the feedback and
Well, I think that's like the equivalent of like when you're in the South and somebody says, "Oh, bless your heart."
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Bless their heart. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the church I think was probably be my first, you know, multiple different churches that I've done that at be my first kind of full-time gig. And to be a church musician, you have to be to be a successful church full-time person, you have to be multifaceted. I have to be able to speak to the drummer, to be able to speak, um, to the piano player. I have to be able to read music and chord charts and understand theory. And at Mountain View's case, be a choir conductor. They had a choir, and
Right.
um, and
It's a lot.
be
But
ready. I think that's probably the biggest thing is if you're transitioning into, even if it's not the exact job that you want, if it gets your foot into the door of the arts and it's something you can be remotely good at, practice getting better, take it. Like do that job, because we always view careers and jobs as like a forever thing.
right.
Like, oh, I don't want to be associated with that because that's not what I really want to do. But is it a step in the right direction from working at McDonald's or your full-time career in working a 9 to 5? That isn't exactly what you want to do either.
It sounds like you kind of eased into your career in music, like in a way. At first, your career was in gigs and then taking them as they would come to you. And then you got into a real full time position at the church, like as a
Hmm.
music director.
Hmm.
And then was that the point where you really cut out all the other types of work in your life altogether?
Yeah, I think so. When I got the job from at the church full time, I was fresh out of grad school, and I just knew I had there were a lot of people graduating with the same degree, master's degree from Western Oregon University. And in talking to a lot of them, about half of them refused to kind of move away from that area in this little town of Monmouth and or even Salem area. They wanted to find a job right there. Um, and
Yeah. I mean,
as far as I know, the ones who were willing to move away, the ones I've stayed in contact with, the ones that were willing to move away for work are still doing full-time music or arts type careers. Some of them teaching and some of them performing and some of them both. And then the ones who were, really willing not to go anywhere, they still are involved in music, but they've, had to come to the terms with, working a part-time or full-time job to supplement their music income.